Hey everyone, it's Ron Johnson, and this is the Ron Johnson Show on Locked On Sports Minnesota. The Minnesota Wild, they lose in a shootout. That's 2 games back-to-back losing to Vegas. Still in the playoffs, though. But we'll talk to Joe O'Donnell, play-by-play announcer for the Minnesota Wild. We'll get his thoughts on this season, what he's seen, what's going on in that Wild locker room, and what are their thoughts long-term? Where do they think they can go? Because in the building, we know there's a different voice, but there was a Final Four played. There was a championship played last night. Uconn is the champion. One, is Uconn a blue blood? Because people were saying there wasn't any blue bloods in this tournament. Uconn, can we consider them a blue blood? And why was the women's tournament so much more exciting than the men's? But I think there was only up to a point. And we'll talk about that next, coming up on the Ron Johnson Show.
Locked On Sports Minnesota Podcasts. It's endless Minnesota Vikings talk with the diverse voices of your local experts. Now the Ron Johnson Show. On the field, in the broadcast booth, Ron Johnson is Minnesota sports. He's played with them, hung out with them, and grown up with all the big names in Minnesota sports. They're hanging out with Ron Johnson. It's the Ron Johnson Show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota podcast. And it starts now.
Hey, everybody, I'm Ron Johnson, and this is the Ron Johnson Show on Locked On Sports Minnesota. I'm going to bring my producer in, Sam Ekstrom. We got Joe O'Donnell joining us in the Hanging with Ron Johnson segment today. He works for the Minnesota Wild. He's the play-by-play announcer. He is one of the best. And the hockey team, they're in the playoffs, so we got to talk to him and get his ideas. We also, this week, stay tuned, because we have Michael Grady coming on. He is the play-by-play for the Timberwolves. So we're doing a full winter play-by-play, I guess, week you want to call it. But remember, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Just visit FanDuel.com/Locked On to get started. And also remember, people, you can download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Amazon Fire and Roku. Just go to your Amazon Fire and your Roku device. Just search Locked On Sports Minnesota. You'll see our faces right there on your TV. You can get all of our videos, all of our shows. Well, like I said in the show, we're going to talk about the Timberwolves. We have to talk about the Wild. But I'm going to jump out there first. Before I jump into the Wild, I'm going to jump out there. The Final Four is all done. Congratulations to Evan McGraw. He won. He picked UConn. He won the Locked On Sports Minnesota pot. My money, I'm going to shoot him the money today, $100. Congratulations to Evan McGraw. He picked the Huskies to win. So I think whoever had picked the Huskies, there's a bunch of guys that jumped up there to pick the Huskies last minute out of the blue. So honestly, the way these tournaments go and these brackets go, if you pick a winner, you probably have a high chance of winning if you do well early. All of my Final Four guys were done. I know, Sam, you had UCLA. You had no shot either. It's just one of those things where when you pick the winner. But when you look at the Final Four, women's and men's, I personally don't think the women's tournament was exciting the entire time. This is my take on this, because everybody's saying, like, man, the women's tournament was so much more exciting than the men's. No, this is what I think. Because I honestly, I don't think anybody watched the round of 64 for the women. I don't think anybody watched the 32. When it got down to the Sweet 16, that's when the Caitlin Clark things, the Haley Van Lifts, that started happening. And then people started like, whoa, Haley Van Lift just went off on this girl, told her to go to Miami, like have fun. And then, whoa, wait, did she just, you can't see me? John Cena to Haley Van Lith? Whoa, did she just do it back to, like, we were involved in the drama. We were involved in the big names down the stretch. Dawn Staley, Kim Mulkey. Like, we were involved in that, all the antics. Like, it got exciting in the Sweet 16 for the women, but for the men, people were watching the play-in games. They were watching the round of 64, the 32, the Sweet 16. Then it got boring. I hate to say it. It was reversed. The men started out hot. Everybody was excited about their brackets. They're watching it. And then FAU wins. And then I think Princeton won. Like, big name, big teams started getting knocked off the board, which took the excitement out of it. Like, if it was Duke, Kentucky, North Carolina, and UConn, leave UConn in it. Everybody's watching it because they're like, oh, man, we got Duke in this. We got Kansas. We got Alabama or Houston in this. Everybody's still going to be dialed in because Alabama, we know, had one of the best players in the country. He's, quote unquote, going to be a top 5 draft pick. So I think that's where it was. The Stars, their teams didn't step up and win these games. The women's did not let us down. Their Stars stayed in and won these games. And that's why the women's Final Four and the Elite Eight even were better than the men's, because the men's Stars got eliminated. And the question is FAU. Now, here's what the thing is. I heard this today. Is teams like FAU and San Diego State now in jeopardy of losing their guys to bigger schools with NIL money? Because that's the next step. Like if you're FAU and you all of a sudden hit the big stage and nobody knows you, now they know you. What's the chances he stays at FAU or he ends up at UConn or he ends up at Villanova? That's just my thoughts. But I think it was in reverse. The women started out slow, got hot because the Stars showed up. Caitlin Clark, Haley Van Lith, like they showed up. The men's, the Stars, they lost. The big blue bloods, they lost other than UConn. That's why I think it was a change. I don't know, Sam. What do you think?
So I follow a few people on Twitter that tweet a lot about TV ratings, and the numbers that they're putting out for the championship in the women's game are, I think, record-setting. I think it's not even close to the next closest or next most viewed women's championship game of all time. It was like 9.9 million. Mm-hmm. And that was a Sunday afternoon, Ron. Remember, if it had been Sunday night, that number probably even goes up. I thought the women's Final Four stole the weekend. The men's buzzer beater was fun in the first game Saturday, but then last night's game, the championship, it was competitive for about 3 minutes down the stretch where San Diego State cut it to 5 very briefly, and then UConn hit a 3, and from that point on, it was over. It wasn't really that compelling. There weren't a lot of stars to get behind. Really didn't know much about the coaches either. Brian Dutcher's dad, Jim, he used to coach for the Gophers. There's the Minnesota connection. But I felt like storyline-wise, way more to talk about with the women. I thought the biggest storyline last night was Jim Nance's Final Four game. Like, that was the biggest storyline in my mind. The game itself wasn't that interesting.
Well, I actually watched a little bit of the pregame. It was like a 2-hour pregame show on ESPN. So I watched a little bit, but I did like the story. Like I said, I talked about yesterday, Steve Fisher's son, who suffers from ALS, but he's on the staff and they've continued to keep him around, and he's doing a great job. Steve Fisher kind of explained the device he's using, how Steve Fisher helps him out, but he wants to be around for his son through this stretch of life. And that was one compelling story. You also had Hurley. Bobby Hurley's little brother is coaching. And so when you see him coaching, even like you go back to the days of his, like he had a real iconic moment a couple years ago. I think 2020, they got knocked out. He said, yeah, you guys better beat us now because we're coming, which Deion Sanders is saying the same thing now, and he's here, he won. And so he was right. You better knock us off now while we're young, because once we get going, we're going to win. And that's why it's good for UConn. I think more schools are going to take a look at that. They don't have the one and dones. They built it. They did have, I think, 1 or 2 transfers come in, but they built it. Those guys are not like freshmen and trying to go win something. They built it a little bit. Some guys are still there from the 2020, the 2020 team. And so, even those stories, and you look at like him way back in the day when he was like super excited with his team, and then corporate it up to do the handshake line with the coaches. So like he had some stories. Bobby Hurley was in there as well, because we know Bobby Hurley's a coach too. But yeah, you're right. There were no stars. There were no big names. There were no Jalen Roses, Chris Webbers, Greg Ostertag, with the I'm going way back in the day with North Carolina,
yeah.
But there were no big there were no Carmelo Anthony's, Dwayne Wade's, like there were no names like that. Chet Holmgren, Jalen Suggs. Like there wasn't that. The guys that should have been there, Alabama, Duke, Kentucky, with guys that are going to be, top 10 picks, they lost. And I think that's the problem. If you have those top 10 quote unquote picks playing in the Final Four, people are going to watch because they're like, man, this kid is the next guy. Like he's the next, Kevin Durant, or he's the next whatever. You didn't have that. Like Victor, people wanted to see Victor Wembanyama probably play more, so they wanted to see this Final Four for the men. Like honestly, like they would have rather seen him commit to one of those schools to be able to play if he had went to UConn instead of the G League or wherever he's at overseas. I think that's part of it. Like there was no star, and the women did though. They had Caitlin Clark. She's one of the best college basketball players ever. I do want people to relax though, because you're forgetting. Diana Taurasi is my girl. So let's pump the brakes on the best ever. She's really good. Yes. She's doing some things in college basketball that have not been done. Yes. But do not forget about Paige Beckers, because she's coming back next year for her senior year off of injury, a year and a half, almost 2 years of injury. So we'll see if she can get it going again. But Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird, Rebecca Lobo, like, come on. Like, Cheryl Swoops, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Candace Parker, like, yeah, Caitlin Clark is that girl. But do not forget, Diana Taurasi was that woman. Like, she was the best. Like, she won everything, and that's the big difference. Now, the other difference, too, UConn those days had a team. Like, they were a full team of stars, where Iowa is just her. Because people are like, oh, Iowa's a good team. Nah, they're Caitlin Clark. That's what they are. So it'll be interesting to see like what happens with this men's versus women's, the NIL this offseason, because now what Miami did, getting to the Final Four with their 900,000, more coaches and schools are going to say, hey, this is the way to do it. But we do have to talk about the Wild. They did lose in a shootout, 3-2, more shots on goal, but they just couldn't find a way to win that game. But we do have Joe O'Donnell coming up next in the Ron Johnson Show. He's going to sit down and talk to us about the Minnesota Wild, the playoff run, and what can happen going forward with this team. Kirill Kaprizov, are we going to see him again? We'll talk about that next. But remember, Locked On Sports is a proud partner with Care 11. Just go to care11.com/locked on to see all of our videos, all of our shows will be right there on your computer. And we have a word from our sponsors.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's America's #1 sportsbook. And as the NBA playoffs approach, it's a great time to join. New customers can claim a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, download the safe, secure, super easy-to-use FanDuel Sportsbook app. Bet on money lines, point scorers, three-pointers drained. You can stack the bets up within the same game for a same-game parlay for some big-time payouts. Get that no-sweat first bet. New customers up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, check out FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Well, now I got Joe O'Donnell joining me in the Hang on the Ron Johnson segment. Super random. Ran into Joe O'Donnell while I was doing work for game one, dropping off some hockey jerseys hockey jerseys and sweatshirts for Benilde St. Margaret High School. And Joe O'Donnell happened to be in there. We were introduced, and I'm like, oh, yeah. I'm like, yeah, I've been to one game. Todd Fregerson invited me out to the playoff game last year. And so I'm going to try to get to a playoff game this year. Just my daughter's softball and all that stuff with Mission Fast Pitch. I just don't have a ton of time. But I do want to try to get to another game. So it'd be my second official NHL game in my life, but looking forward to it. But Joe, thank you for joining me on the Ron Johnson Show. I'm going to jump out there quick, man. Like, you got into this business. At what point in your life did you realize, like, hey, I can do play-by-play for hockey?
Well, thanks for having me on, Ron. Good to see you, buddy. And maybe we'll just call you Playoff Ron if you only come around for the Stanley Cup playoffs. Is that the deal?
Yeah, I'll take that.
All right. I like that. I appreciate you having me. I went to the University of Delaware. I knew I wasn't going to play hockey. I found that pretty quickly out with my very average high school career. And so one of the first days there, I went to the radio station. I was like, I want to call hockey games, like the freshman orientation type deal. And they were like, sure, show up at the rink on Friday. I got to know some of the staff. I passed the radio station tests you got to take. Started to get on air a little bit. And then I think by junior year, I was calling games. And that was sort of like, all right, this is something I want to pursue. It's something I want to do. And I just seemed to have a little bit of a knack for it. At no point, obviously you want to get to the NHL, right? But I don't think there's ever like I can do this moment, because there's so many great broadcasters out there. You really just have to catch some breaks. You got to get a little lucky. You got to stay with it, have some people in your corner. Been fortunate enough to be with the Wild organization since 2008, and down in Houston of the American League. Then the Houston team moved to Iowa. I was there for 8 years. And then when Bob Kurtz started to scale back on his games, I got an opportunity to jump in and do some games with Tom Reed. And it was a dream come true, really, sort of a goal achieved. And I'm really thrilled to be here with my family this year, doing every game on the radio on KFAN and the Wild Radio Network. And it's been awesome so far.
Yeah, and so speaking of the Wild Radio Network, I was hosting K-Fan on Sunday, I think, Sam, right? Yeah, I did Sunday sermons on Sunday for Dan Barrero. He was out, and got a bunch of text messages because me and Kevin Foulness always get into it about chicken. And it was a big chicken debate. Do you wash your chicken? Do you not wash your chicken? I'm not going to ask you that. But how annoying is Kevin Foulness? Like because you work with him, or how much fun is, because some people, he annoys them. They love him. And then some people are just like, look, Kevin's great. But how is it working with Kevin Foulness?
I think I'd rather answer the chicken question.
do you wash your chicken? Like when you get a chicken breast?
Yeah, I clean it.
But do you have like a special bowl and like you got a special bowl? You just wash it.
I'll take it out of the package. I'll rinse it off. I'll trim it off if it needs to be trimmed, and that's that.
Thank you. That's going on social media. I'm tagging Kevin Foulness because he swears that you don't need to wash it. I'm like, I look at that gook in there in the packaging. I'm like, you gotta wash that. That's just me. That's how I grew up. But how is it working with Kevin Foulness?
It's great. Kevin and I have known each other a long time. He does a lot of work behind the scenes for every broadcast. Obviously, you hear him pregame, postgame, intermission, doing his podcast, hosting Wild Weekly with Brandon Molesky, doing interviews to cut up audio for the pregame show or whatever. So, yeah, he does a lot. Obviously, you hear him a lot leading up to Wild games and after Wild games and on KFAN. But, sort of behind the scenes, he puts in a lot of work in the background to make sure that the broadcasts are as professional as they are.
Yeah, because it's funny because I know him off like radio, off whatever, and so he's a total goofball. And then you see him get serious with hockey, so it always amazes me when I hear like a radio broadcast and I hear Kevin Foulness maybe doing the pregame, and I'm like, what? Because they did. I think they called me last year for the pregame show because I had gone to my first game, and so they called me like to ask me about it. It was before the next game, and just like, what did I think? What do I think is going to happen? So on and so forth. It was like him and Tennessee. And so, I gave my takes, which I had no idea. My take is always whoever shoots the puck the most, they'll win. But that didn't happen. Like the Wild had more shots on goal against the Vegas. And they already had lost to Vegas in Vegas. And then they came home, and they lose again. Why is like that not a formula? Because I hear a lot of coaches actually do say that, like, hey, we got to get more shots on goal than them, and we probably win this game. But that didn't happen. Like what happened in that night for the Knights? Was it their goalie? Again, is it Kirill Kaprizov? They still are missing his stick handling. I don't know what, but what's going on with that where they lose back to back to Vegas?
Well, you start to wonder a little bit if it's a matchup thing against the Golden Knights, because Vegas won all 3 meetings of the season series. Now, the Wild played in February when Vegas came to town. The Wild were in a little bit of funk after the All-Star break. Maybe they played one of their worst games of the year. Vegas won 5-1. Mm-hmm. Saturday in Vegas, maybe a little bit of a hangover from the big win in Colorado and 3 nights in Vegas. The Wild score first, they lose 4-1. But last night in St. Paul, Minnesota played a good hockey game. They deserved probably better than they got, which is the 1 point for the shootout loss. Vegas tied the game with 30 seconds left. If you can get that puck, if you're the Wild and you clear it out maybe 1 or 2 more times to your defensive zone, you probably win the hockey game. So it was a little frustrating that they came up a little short last night, given the fact they were leading into the final 37 seconds or whatever it was. But to your point about shooting the puck, you've got to. Dean Evason's talked about it all year long. You got to have a shooter's mentality, whether it's an individual player like Matt Boldy, who is now scoring at a torrid clip because he's shooting more, or whether it's just getting pucks past the other team's shot blockers through to the net, rebounds, tips, greasy goals, as we call them. It's important. But shot volume isn't always key, Ron. Mm-hmm. You go back to a game, the Wild haven't lost in regulation, but twice in the last 23 games or whatever.
Wow.
Right before that stretch was a loss to Colorado, where they outshot the Avalanche in St. Paul 43-19. 43-19, and they lost the hockey game. So it's not always about shooting the puck, right? Sometimes you run into a hot goaltender. Sometimes you catch a bad break or a bad bounce. But, your initial point from afar, so to speak, I agree with. Like, if you're possessing the puck, if you're generating opportunities, if you're winning foot races for some of those second and third chances around the side of the net and having a high shot volume, you should generally have success most nights.
And when you look at Marc-Andre Fleury, or the Flower as they call him, last year in the playoffs, it was a question of who should be in between the pipes. Should it be Fleury? Should it be the other guy? Now this year, he's back kind of in that again. What is that going to look like again this year, in your opinion? Like, do you think you go with Flower and just say, you know what, like last year, maybe we didn't give him enough chances? Or do you just play the hot hand and you kind of do your statistics and say, look, the last 10 games, here's, how many goals you've given up. Here's how many goals you've given up. Be honest with both of them and say, this is why this guy's going to be in the pipes tonight.
Well, last year, Marc-Andre Fleury was acquired because of his history, right? His pedigree, the Stanley Cup championships, one of the winningest goalies ever. Cam Talbot actually played better down the stretch.
Correct.
Yet Fleury started game 1. Fleury started all the way until game 6. Was that a mistake? I don't know. Hindsight's 20/20. This year, I do believe that the Wild will explore using both goaltenders, both Philip Gustafsson, who's second in the league in goals against and save percentage, and obviously the soon-to-be Hall of Famer Marc-Andre Fleury, who's been just as good as Gustafsson down the stretch numbers-wise. I think you might see both goaltenders, which in the NHL would be very rare when you get to the Stanley Cup playoffs. Sometimes you see it, but mostly it's, here's our guy, and we play him until he loses, or until he loses 2 in a row or 3 in a row. Sometimes you just ride him through the series. That's typically been the NHL over the last, I don't know how many years, right? You have your 1 and your 1B, and that's that, right? Here's our starter, and we roll with them. Teams have used 2 goalies, but again, not to the point where I think the Wild might, which is like, hey, game 1, maybe it's Gustafsson. Game 2 could be Fleury. Game 3 could be Gustafsson. The Wild have rotated him pretty much all year long, even coming after a shutout or a 40-save performance. They'll go to the other guy the next game. And I think their thought process is like, if we're doing this now and it's working in the regular season, why would we change it in the playoffs? Just because the history of the NHL says to? Like, I think the Wild are going to seriously consider using both goalies.
Yeah, and it's crazy too, because you look at their save percentage. Gustafsson is a 0.932, and then Fleury's at 91%. Like, I mean, they're both really high save percentages, and Fleury, though, his 91%, 1,100 shots, where Gustafsson's only seeing 900. So you do have to equate that too. The minutes played, he has them by about 400 minutes played as well. For Fleury, has that edge. So you have to take that into account. Like, hey, if this guy were to get 400 more minutes, what would his shots look like? Would his percentage drop down to 89? Like you gotta play that game, and I know you know that as well, because I mean, coaches look at that with quarterbacks. Same thing when you're going into training camp. If we have a quarterback controversy, more so in college than the NFL, but what do we do? But when you look at going to a guy like Kirill Kaprizov, and funny too, I was at TRIA last year when they were doing their exit physicals. I had no idea who he was. Like, I didn't realize until like all these like people in the lobby like start like fawning over the kid sitting over in the corner who was about to walk out. And then the only reason I thought about it is because I recognized Dumba. And so when I saw Matt Dumba, I'm like, oh, that's and I couldn't think of his name. And then I heard a kid say it, but he looks so young. Like, he looks like a teenager, like a 15-year-old. And so when you think about that, like his youthfulness, his ability to, who knows how long he can play, like a Sidney Crosby. Do you think Kirill Kaprizov, because right now 74 points, hasn't played it and God knows when, but he's still the number 1 point scorer on the team. Zuccarella's getting close, 66. You got Eriksson at 61. Like you said, Bodie at 60, who's on a hot clip right now. But when you think about Kirill Kaprizov, when it's all said and done, if he were to continue to play at this speed, do you think he will be considered like a Sidney Crosby, or do you think he can jump into that like Yzerman, never Gretzky, but that conversation? Like, where do you think he'll fall?
I think right now he's a top 10 player in the NHL, especially if you're taking out the goaltenders. You're just looking at skaters, and that might be on the conservative side. I mean, you could argue that he's the best left winger in the National Hockey League. His numbers have been outstanding. Every time he hits a milestone, you look at some of the other players in his category, right? Like the fastest to 200 career points amongst active players, and the list is like Crosby, Ovechkin, McDavid, and Kaprizov, right? Like, it's just the company he's keeping early in his career is pretty remarkable. He's on that trajectory towards, one of obviously the all-time great Minnesota Wild players, but certainly potential to be one of the great players of this generation. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because of his work ethic, his compete level, the fact that he's such an unselfish player from a team standpoint. I mean, Dean Evison, the Wild head coach, has said this before, like, all Kaprizov wants to do is win. Like, he doesn't care about the individual accolades and milestones and achievements. He wants to win hockey games. Last year, he came into Dean Evason's office. Dean thought he was going to complain about not getting enough ice time or this or that. And he was like, we're not winning right now. How do I help the team win more? So that's all you need to know about Kaprizov from a superstar standpoint. I think he is that good, Ron. I think he can be that good moving forward. You list off some great names, some Hall of Famers. And if he plays 10 years in this league at the pace he's playing at right now, he'll be right there, as one of the greats, obviously, of his generation. And I think you could start to talk about bigger picture should we get that far.
And when you look at the two centers for Edmonton, you got Connor McDavid and his counterpart, 146 points, 120 points. They lead the league 1 and 2, and they're on the same team. What is Edmonton doing? Like, are they just skating at a different speed than everybody else, and they have a different formula to say, look, I don't care where you are, just shoot it? Like, what is going on in Edmonton where you look at the Wild and they don't have anybody even close to that, and Kirill has only played 65 games and he is the number one guy? Like, what does Edmonton do that maybe the Wild can eventually mimic, whether it is bringing in another guy to help Kirill out, or if it's finding a guy to skate alongside of him or be in the second line to help him out? Like, I don't know what the formula is, but Edmonton, that's crazy. Like, what's going on there?
There's just nothing else to do in Edmonton except play hockey. So those guys just skate 24/7. No, McDavid is, look, maybe arguably the greatest player right now, and maybe not even much of an argument, and potentially could go down as one of the greatest ever. Leon Draisaitl is a running mate you touched on.
Yeah,
he's just a machine. He's a huge, like, imposing figure on the ice. I consider him like a unit, right? Like, he's a beast. And on the power play, they're both ridiculous. So, look, ultimately they've got to win a Stanley Cup to get where they want to be in their place in history. They haven't done that yet. Connor McDavid still relatively young, Draisaitl still relatively young, but they're as good as it gets. And they're going to end up with 3 players this year with 100 points because you're going to add Ryan Nugent-Hopkins to that list. That's something that I can't remember. You probably got to go back to the 90s the last time that was done with like some of those great Penguins teams or Red Wings teams. So it hasn't been done in a while. So yes, to your point, they can score goals. They can fill up the stat sheet. It'll be interesting to see how they handle it in the spring. Last year, they had a little bit of playoff success, but they lost in the conference finals. They got swept by the Avalanche, if I remember correctly. So they got further than they had in the past. They hadn't been out of the first round prior to last year, but it'll be interesting this year to see how they handle it. We all know it's like any playoff sport, right? In the NBA, things tighten up defensively. It becomes a half-court game. In the NHL, things are going to tighten up, right? You're going to have, if the Wild and Oilers play, for instance, you're going to have Jonas Brodin and or Jared Spurgeon on the ice every single time that McDavid and Draisaitl are on the ice in a potential playoff matchup, especially when the games are in St. Paul, where the home team gets the last change, right? They can kind of dictate the matchup. And so McDavid's going to see that. He sees it all year now anyway, right? Always getting the top defensive pairings from the other team. But in the playoffs, when it generally becomes harder to score, and when the matchups and everything's intensified and scrutinized, we'll see how McDavid and Draisaitl do. They're going to get their points ultimately in a long series, but it's, can they get over the top? Can they get to a Stanley Cup final? Can they win a Stanley Cup? Those are the big questions there in Edmonton with 2 of the game's great players.
And last one before we get out of here, and we head to the Daily 3. That's me, Joe Donnell, and Sam Ekstrom's going to join the show. And he's gonna throw the questions out. Joe's going to get most of the time. I'll pick up where he left off. That's 3 questions, 3 minutes each. But before you jump into that, Joe, again brought up this. Kirill Kaprizov is out. What is inside the building or the staff or the coaches? What are they kind of saying to the media? What the timeline is for Kirill Kaprizov?
Well, he's going to practice with the team tomorrow. And when that happens, it's my understanding he saw docs yesterday. He's been skating a couple days on his own, but he will practice with the team tomorrow, is my understanding. And if that occurs, then it's all systems go. My guess is he would need maybe one more team practice and then probably get into the last game or 2 of the regular season, potentially more than that, but I don't see the need for that, right? It's Kaprizov. He's a gamer. Get him up to game speed with a game or 2 at the most, and then put them in bubble wrap for the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Wild clinched last night, their 12th ever playoff appearance. You want to be healthy going in. Last year, they really pushed hard for first round home ice advantage over the Blues, and it didn't end up really benefiting Minnesota much. This year, I think they'll be a touch more careful. I think they'll look to make sure guys are more ready and rested for the Stanley Cup playoffs. And if they have to play on, a neutral site, somebody else's building on Pluto, like I think they'd rather be healthy and ready to go than so focused on we've got to win every one of our last 5 games. We've got to get Kaprizov as many games as possible, because ultimately I think they want to be at their best for the playoffs with the health factor being paramount.
Yeah, I will say I've been in the building for the playoffs at home. I do understand home ice. That atmosphere is nuts. And I was told I was spoiled because the game I went to, it was like 3 consecutive goals by the Wild. And so it was like nonstop people jumping up, swinging the white flags or the white towels. And so, yeah, I heard I was by the people in like next to me because they realized who I was from Vikings Game Day Live. And then they also heard me on KFan and realized it was my first game. And so they were like just telling me everything going on in the game. And like, look, it never really happens like this. So don't think every time you go to a hockey game, you're going to see 3 to 4 back-to-back goals between, I think it was like 4 goals in the span. I can't remember. It was the Blues game or whoever they played last year at home, but it was like 4 goals within like a span of minutes because I think the Wild scored, the Blues scored, and then the Wild scored 2. And I think it was a hat trick even because the hats were thrown on the ice. So it was a crazy playoff game and atmosphere that I'm glad me and my wife got to enjoy. And you threw this out there about Kirill. He is going to be skating with the team, hopefully. And then at that point, like you said, like with skating, you don't just jump back on the ice if you're hurt still. Because that's painful in itself. But how important is he? Last one. How important is he to this team to be able to make it to the Stanley Cup final?
Crucial. I mean, he is the biggest piece. I think it's been good that the Wild have played well without him. I think there will be a little transition getting him back as far as just reshuffling the lines. But you hope it's like riding a bike, right? Where like you haven't forgotten it. You just take a second, you're right back in the swing of things. But he's ultimately the biggest piece to the puzzle for Minnesota because of his game-breaking ability. He's a superstar. When the game's on the line, he plays his best, right? You can just tell there's nights where he's the hungriest player on the ice. He will not be denied. And that sort of mentality, coupled with his skill set, if the Wild play the right way defensively and have a superstar like Kaprizov in their lineup, I think they've got a good chance to get out of the first round, which will be much needed for this Wild fan base that has been just begging for this team to go on a run in the playoffs.
Well, as I say, we got the Daily 3 coming up. That's 3 questions, 3 minutes each. But hey, remember, you can check out the Minnesota Football Party 4 days a week from Monday to Thursday. Get your Vikings fix with Arif Hassan, Luke Inman, Luke Braun, and Sam Ekstrom on Locked On Sports Minnesota. And we have a word from our sponsors.
Thanks, Ron. Let me tell you about NFL Draft Buzz. That is the NFL Draft newsletter authored by our own Luke Inman here at Locked On Sports Minnesota. Get up to date on everything happening in the draft world, rankings, stories, links to other Locked On shows. It's NFL Draft Buzz. Subscribe at lockedonpodcast.com/newsletters.
Well, it's time for the part of the show I love the most, and that's the Daily 3. That's 3 questions, 3 minutes each. Take it away, Sam.
All right, this question is for Ron because Ron loves talking movies. But Joe, let me direct it to you first. What is the best hockey movie ever made?
This is a tough one, man. I'm not going to lie, and I'm going to be on the fence a little bit here, and I'm going to apologize for that in advance. But obviously, you got to put Miracle up there somewhere, right? Just because of how much it meant to the hockey world. It's still talked about 40 plus years later, and what it meant culturally. Given the Cold War and the whole dynamic there, U.S. and Russia. So Miracle, obviously a great hockey movie. But I love Youngblood. Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze, Keanu Reeves. It's a great hockey movie. So I would take Youngblood, but you can't forget about the younger generation. You know, I was born in 1980. So growing up really like sort of late 80s, early 90s, the Mighty Ducks movies, the trilogy, the initial 3 there, I certainly got to give a little stick tap to those as well.
Yeah, for me, it's funny. Like I don't really watch, like I told everybody knows that. I'm not a big hockey guy. I grew up in Detroit, but that wasn't some African-American young inner city black kids did. We didn't go to Red Wings games. Like it just wasn't something we thought about doing. But I did get introduced to hockey because of the Mighty Ducks. I had no idea it was out of Minnesota until actually being here for a while and realizing like the movie and people talking about Adam Banks and Edina and Cake Eaters and all that. So I have to go with Mighty Ducks. But here's some that I've heard, like Slapshot. I don't think I've ever seen that one. What was the other one that I was gonna say? Like, oh, you just said it. Miracle on Ice. I've never seen that. Like, and so some of these I just don't know. Goon, like again, but the one that gets me every time is like Happy Gilmore, because when you put in hockey movie, Happy Gilmore comes up because he was a hockey guy, and so if they're gonna consider Happy Gilmore a hockey movie, I gotta go with Happy Gilmore, but it's like a golf movie, so I don't know. It's like a crossover. It's a crossover of golf and hockey, but I got to go Mighty Ducks. That's a classic. That's one, but I am gonna because I know we're going on vacation for my daughter's softball team. We're going to Colorado. We have a couple trips, Iowa, Colorado. So I do plan on, because I know those days are like long days at the park. And so I do plan on downloading some of those type of movies because I kind of made a list of there's some other movies I need to watch, but yeah, I'll go with Mighty Ducks. I'm just going to say that for me, that's always going to be the one. There was another one. I can't remember what it was. It was more of like a killer movie, but like they killed a dude on the ice with a
Sudden
Zamboni.
Death.
Yeah. Yep. That was
Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Jean-Claude Van Damme. Yeah. There it is. Yep. So that would be up there for me too, because I do remember that one. I remember the Zamboni and the guy getting killed. Like that's all I remember.
I'm gonna get crushed for not saying Slapshot. I'm fully aware of that, but and that's fine. But I just, I got to stick with my guns. The ones I've watched the most Miracle, Youngblood, and Mighty Ducks.
I saw Slapshot very late in life, and I didn't think it translated as well. I think you had to see it more in its era to really appreciate it. I didn't love Slapshot when I saw it. Miracle's my number one with a bullet. It's just so good. And like and it's obviously a very made for Hollywood kind of script, like being the Soviets, the team that had won 4 in a row, and you beat them in such improbable fashion, but they didn't have to make any of it up. It all happened. It was all real. Very cool. Next one for you, Joe. You touched on your path to being a play-by-play announcer. I'm curious, along the way, were there any obscure or unusual events that you got to call that are amusing or noteworthy?
Well, I mean, hockey-wise, I feel like I've seen a lot. I still haven't called a goalie goal, which I'm hoping for. But I have seen and called a line brawl or two and a goalie fight years ago. But from like another sport perspective, I really didn't broadcast other sports. Even in college, I did a couple of innings of baseball once upon a time. I did some color analysis on like a lacrosse game, maybe a soccer match. But for the most part, I was all hockey. So when you pose that question, the thing that comes to mind most recently is about a month ago, I broadcasted my kids' scored hockey game. Minnesota, they're crazy about hockey, right? So every game this year was being live streamed, and most times they had a dad announcing it all year long. And so they got to the district playoffs or whatever, and I don't want to say it was the elephant in the room, but it's like, I'm an NHL radio guy, and I hadn't asked or jumped on any of the webcasts of my kids' hockey game yet. Now, obviously, I'm on the road. I don't get to make every game, but I was like, all right, I need to do this. So I did broadcast the game from, I think we're in Bloomington at the Ice Garden. And so I did a web stream of a squirt hockey game about a month ago. And I will say that was, I was prepared. Don't you worry, Ron and Sam. But that was different, to say the least.
I don't think I've ever done any weird thing. Like I said, I'm the same. I'm all football. I've done high school football. I guess that was interesting because high school football is not a ton of action unless it's two teams that are going to really throw the ball. So I think I did, who was it? Lakeville versus Farmington. And literally I started Tony Romo in the game at one point because it's back when Bernhardt, who went to Nebraska, played for Lakeville North. And every time he came in, every time they went unbalanced, which they put 4 linemen on one side, 2 to the other, they ran that way. And so at one point I just started watching where he went. I'm like, oh, it's going to be toss right. Oh, here we go. Toss left. Oh, but they're going to counter it back right, even though it looks like they might run left. And I saw tweets from parents at home watching it. They're like, man, this guy is good. I'm like, no, this offense is very easy to figure out. Lakeville, they told you what they're going to do. We have a D1 lineman, 6'6", 300-pound in high school. We're going to run behind them. And so, yeah, I guess that's the most unusual, that it became so easy because Lakeville told you what they were going to do. But yeah, I'm the same. I've done, basically just all football. But I do have a good one for this next one though. So what you got next, Sam?
Yeah. I want to know what Joe's favorite road NHL venue is, because he's probably been to every rink.
I have. And that was awesome when I finally got to them all, to be quite honest, sort of like a little bucket list. Like, hey, I've seen every building. This is also a tough one, guys, because you could factor in like away from the rink, right? City like Nashville or Vegas. You could talk about the amenities within a rink, the broadcast perch, how's the vantage point, the press meal, right? You got to factor in a lot of things when you're talking about a road arena. But we were just in Vegas the other night. They've got a great viewpoint there, and that building is electric. So that's a fun one. I also like going to Detroit. The building's brand new, Little Caesars Arena, and they have an awesome broadcast setup. And I like Staples Center in LA too, or it's now Crypto.com Arena. Their broadcast vantage point is one of the best in the league. So if I'm talking from a broadcast standpoint, those are some of the spots where it's easiest to call the game. You don't feel like you're a mile and a half away. But obviously you got to factor in what you can do away from the rink in some of these cities that we go to, whether it's dinner and night out, whether it's a day off and you're going out in the afternoon, you want to sit outside and have a couple beers. Those things are all important, in my opinion, as well, when you're factoring a road city.
Yeah, I was going to say I haven't been to it, but I'm guessing Vegas. Because it's Vegas. And the fact that those guys went out there for 3 days, I actually went to Vegas and in Reno with Anthony LaPanta, friend of yours, I'm pretty sure, Joe. And so Anthony LaPanta and I covered, I think 4 games for FS1 last year, FS1, FS2, or the year before last. And so we did like Nevada versus New Mexico State. We did San Diego State versus somebody, I can't remember. And I'll never forget like showing up. Both times we're in Vegas. I think we did Reno a couple times in Vegas, but Mike Russo shows up. It's a football game, has nothing to do with hockey, but he shows up because his boy is Anthony LaPanta, and it is the weirdest duo I've ever seen in my life. Like they are always together. Like LaPanta's wife couldn't find him, so she called Russo like, "Where's tell Anthony to pick up his phone?"
They're close, man.
They are very close. Like we got to the craps table. And they had like this ritual they have to do. Like one person has to be on this side. He has to be here. His son has to be over here. Like super weird. I was at the table with him for a minute. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go walk by myself because this is getting weird.
Do you know that they have a trip that you can like go overseas with the two of them?
No.
Yeah, fans sign up. They pay money to hang out with Russo and LaPanta and let them tell stories, which I get for free on the road, so I don't have to go to Italy to sit with them. But that's like a thing. I did not know that.
So, I mean, do they think they're like the power trip or something? Like, is that their thought now? Like, we're
I'm not going to comment any further. I'm just telling you it's a thing.
We got to get LaPanta on now. I got to text LaPanta now. He's got to come on.
Sounds fun. Might have to join.
Sit down with LaPanta and Rue. We should get them on the show at the same time. Let's just see where the stories go. But I want to thank Joe O'Donnell for joining me on the Ron Johnson Show. It's been great having you. A lot of wild takes. Love it. Looking forward to this playoff run. I'm gonna have to get Todd Fredrickson on here too because I gotta find a way to get more playoff tickets. But Joe, again, when I'm in the building, I'll make sure to check it out. If you want to hear more of Joe O'Donnell, make sure every K-fan hockey game for the Minnesota Wild. That's the beautiful voice you're hearing. I'm Ron Johnson. That's Joe O'Donnell and Sam Ekstrom. I want to thank you guys for joining us. Remember, you can always download on Amazon Fire and Roku. That's just search Locked On Sports Minnesota. And also, wherever you get your podcast, just subscribe, like, and then share. Tell us what you think. Comment. Also, let us know what you think. Is Kirill Kaprizov, that's question of the day, is Kirill Kaprizov going to be up there with Gretzky and Yzerman when it's all said and done? I want to thank you. Have a great day.